Somewhere between a Tennessee porch and a West Virginia holler, grandmothers were quietly pulling off culinary miracles with nothing but a cast-iron skillet, a pantry shelf, and generations of hard-won knowledge. These weren't desperate people eating desperate food. These were skilled cooks turning wild mushrooms, dried beans, garden scraps, and cured pork into appetizers that would make a modern chef stop and take notes. 25 of them, all real, all forgotten. Let's bring them back. Hush Puppies. The legend says Appalachian fish fry cooks tossed these cornmeal fritters to barking dogs with a sharp, "Hush, puppy," and the name stuck. By the 1970s, Hush Puppies were inseparable from every catfish fry and weekend fish camp across the mountains. Coarse yellow cornmeal, buttermilk, diced onion, a pinch of baking soda and salt, mixed thick and dropped by the spoonful into hot grease. They'd roll themselves over in the oil and come out golden, crackling, and steaming inside with a soft, sweet, onion-flecked crumb. At a hillbilly fish fry, whoever made the best batch earned the best seat at the table. Today's fast food versions are a pale imitation. The real thing, made with stone-ground cornmeal and bacon grease, belongs to a different category entirely. If these appetizers were on your table growing up, you weren't missing out. You were eating better than most people ever will. Drop Hillbilly in the comments and subscribe so you never miss another forgotten recipe. Fried green tomatoes. Hollywood made a movie about it. But the real story starts in a late summer Appalachian garden where no tomato was allowed to go to waste. Before the frost hit, families sliced those firm, tart green tomatoes thick, dragged them through seasoned cornmeal and buttermilk, and dropped them into a cast-iron skillet bubbling with bacon grease. The crust that formed was shattering crisp. The inside? Creamy, tangy, almost vinegarish, unlike anything a ripe tomato ever delivers. In 1970s Appalachian homes, setting a plate of these on the table before supper was a quiet act of hospitality and pride. Today, every southern restaurant has them on the menu. None of them taste like Grandma's skillet. Pan-fried okra. Okra is one of the most divisive vegetables in American food history, and 1970s hillbilly cooks solved the controversy completely. Brought to the American South by enslaved Africans centuries earlier, okra had embedded itself permanently in Appalachian cooking by the 1970s. The slimy reputation? Eliminated entirely by high heat, sliced into rounds, tossed in seasoned cornmeal, and fried fast and hot in barely enough bacon fat to coat the skillet bottom. The mucilaginous texture never had a chance to develop. What came out instead was nutty, earthy, slightly sweet, and crunchy in a way that shattered between the teeth like the best vegetable chip you've ever eaten. Mothers used to start a batch to get hungry kids to the table before supper was ready. It worked every single time. Hoe Cakes. George Washington reportedly ate these for breakfast, which tells you everything about their staying power. Hoe Cakes, flat, hand-patted cornmeal cakes cooked on a greased griddle, are one of America's oldest foods, rooted in both Native American and African American culinary tradition. The recipe asked for almost nothing: cornmeal, water, salt, and maybe a touch of fat. No eggs, no leavening, no extras. The batter hit a smoking hot skillet, and the edges crisped and curled. The bottom turned deep mahogany, and the inside stayed dense and moist with a pure, unapologetic corn flavor. In 1970s Appalachia, they landed on the table before supper, spread with lard or drizzled with sorghum molasses as both bread and appetizer. A good hoe cake outside a hillbilly household is nearly impossible to find today. Cracklin Cornbread. Regular cornbread is a good song. Cracklin Cornbread is that same song performed live, loud, and in full. Cracklins, the crispy rendered bits of pork skin and fat left after making lard, went directly into the cornbread batter on hog killing day. The result was extraordinary. A buttermilk cornbread crumb riddled with pockets of smoky, rich pork fat and crunchy pieces of rendered skin that softened just enough in the oven while others stayed crackling crisp. Every wedge delivered tang, savoriness, and texture in the same bite. Serving Cracklin Cornbread before a meal in 1970s Appalachia was a signal of abundance. It meant a hog had been killed and the whole family would eat well for weeks. Today, artisan shops sell pork cracklins as premium snacks. Back then, they were just Tuesday. Corn pone wedges. Corn pone predates cornbread mixes by centuries and outclasses them completely. Cherokee communities taught early Appalachian settlers to press cornmeal dough, nothing but cornmeal, boiling water, salt, and a little bacon grease worked in with bare hands into wedge-shaped patties and bake or fry them until the outside formed a hard, almost clay-like crust, and the inside stayed dense, steaming, and deeply corn-forward. By the 1970s, hillbilly grandmothers were still making them essentially unchanged from that original method. The wedges went on the table before supper for hungry hands and mouths to work on while the main dishes finished cooking. Dipped into pot liquor, smeared with butter if the family had it, or eaten plain. Today, the closest most people get is a box of Jiffy Mix. Real corn pone is a revelation by comparison. Shucky Beans. String a fresh green bean on thread, hang it in the rafters. Wait 6 weeks. That's Shucky Beans, one of the oldest food preservation techniques still practiced in 1970s Appalachia, borrowed directly from Cherokee tradition and kept alive by Scots-Irish mountain families across West Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The drying beans would shrivel, darken, and develop an intense, concentrated flavor, smoky, almost mushroom-like, that bore no resemblance at all to a fresh green bean. Cooked low and slow for hours with fatback or a ham hock in salted water, they emerged silky, dark, and deeply savory. Served as a small dish before the main meal, they tasted ancient, because they were. Food scholars now call Shucky Beans one of the most important surviving examples of indigenous preservation practice in American cooking. In 1970s Appalachia, they were just called supper. Fried ramps. Fair warning, if you've never smelled a ramp cooking, nothing can fully prepare you. These wild leeks, with an aroma somewhere between garlic and onion cranked to full volume, were one of the first wild foods to push through the Appalachian forest floor each April. For families still depleting winter stores, ramp season wasn't just welcome, it was celebrated. Ramp festivals across West Virginia and Virginia date back decades and still run today. Fried in bacon grease until the bulbs softened and sweetened and the broad leaves wilted and crisped at the edges, ramps transformed from ferociously pungent to deeply savory, almost smoky, with a sweetness that surprised everyone who'd only encountered them raw. A seasonal appetizer available for a few weeks a year, then gone. Today, New York fine dining chefs pay premium prices for them. In 1970s Appalachia, you walked up the holler and picked them yourself. Succotash. The name comes from the Narragansett word Succotash, broken corn kernels. Native American communities across the eastern United States had been making this dish for centuries before European contact, and by the 1970s it had settled permanently into Appalachian cooking as something that could be a side, a main, or an appetizer depending on what else was on the table. In a hillbilly skillet, corn kernels and butter beans or lima beans cooked down in bacon fat, salt, and black pepper until the beans were tender and the corn had released its starch into a slightly thick, golden, savory mixture. Sometimes a diced tomato went in near the end, sometimes a splash of cream. Served warm in a small bowl before the main meal, Succotash carried an unbroken lineage stretching thousands of years back to indigenous foodways. Nobody said any of that at the table. They just said it was ready. Bean soup sippers. Nobody ever put this on a restaurant menu, but they should have. Pinto beans, simmered for hours with a ham hock, salt, and black pepper until the beans went creamy and the broth turned silky and complex, produced something extraordinary in the process. Pot liquor. Bean broth. Liquid gold, as hillbilly cooks knew. Bean soup sippers were simply a ladle of that rich, pork-kissed, bean-cloudy broth served in a small cup before dinner, the way a French kitchen sends out a consommé. The broth held the flavor of every hour it had cooked: fat, minerals, starch, smoke, time. For children on cold winter evenings, that cup of warm broth before supper was a sensory memory that stayed for life. Today, boutique stores sell bone broth for $5 a cup. Bean soup sippers were free, made from what was already on the stove, and tasted exactly like home. Pickled green beans. Whole green beans, packed vertical and tight into mason jars with garlic, dill, red pepper flakes, mustard seed, and sharp vinegar brine, emerged from their cold pack processing as something completely different from what went in. Crisp, snappy, tangy, garlicky, and with a slow-building heat from the pepper that crept up quietly after the third or fourth bite. In 1970s Appalachian households, canning pickled green beans was both survival skill and art form. A jar of dilly beans placed on the table before dinner was a gesture of genuine pride. It said, "We planned ahead, we worked hard, we have enough to share." The women who could put up 40 jars in a single day were respected the way athletes are respected. Their recipes were handwritten and guarded. Today, specialty stores sell these for premium prices. The homegrown version from a farmhouse kitchen is something else entirely. Hot water cornbread patties. Boiling water poured directly onto plain cornmeal and salt. That's it. The heat partially cooks the starch and creates a dough unlike any other, shaped by hand into small flat patties and dropped straight into a skillet of hot bacon grease. What comes out has a shatteringly crisp, almost lacquered shell, and a dense, moist, intensely corny interior with lacy caramelized edges and a faint natural sweetness. Rooted deeply in African-American Southern cooking tradition, hot water cornbread patties were the nothing-in-the-house food of 1970s Appalachian kitchens. Something a mother could put together in 15 minutes when unexpected guests showed up. And the guests were always glad to see them. No apology needed. Today, food bloggers are discovering this and calling it revolutionary. Appalachian grandmothers have been making it for over a century. Grits bites. Tapas before tapas existed. That's what grits bites were. Leftover cooked grits, enriched with butter and sometimes sharp cheddar, were poured into a pan and left to set overnight into a firm, sliceable slab. The next day, squares or rounds were cut, dusted in cornmeal, and fried in a skillet until each piece had a golden, crackling crust on both sides. Outside, crisp and firm. Inside, creamy, hot, and if there was cheese in there, pulling in long golden strings. Zero-waste cooking at its finest. Yesterday's breakfast transformed into today's appetizer. Served alongside a jar of chowchow or a spoonful of apple butter, grits bites disappeared from the plate faster than they came off the skillet. Upscale Southern restaurants now serve fried grit cakes for $15 apiece. In 1970s Appalachian kitchens, they cost pennies. Fatback on cornbread. Fatback on cornbread is not a recipe. It's a statement. Thin slices of salt-cured pork fat, briefly rendered in a pan to warm and soften, laid across a fresh-from-the-skillet wedge of cornbread. The fat would begin melting at the edges immediately, soaking down into the crumb and creating something that was simultaneously bread, pork fat, salt, and comfort at a cellular level. No garnish, no sauce, Nothing extra needed. In 1970s Appalachian households, this was what you ate, while the rest of the meal finished cooking. Quick to prepare, deeply satisfying, just enough to blunt serious hunger without ruining the appetite. And offering it to a guest meant something. In households where meat was expensive and precious, sharing fatback on cornbread was genuine generosity. Today, the concept sounds extreme. In the Appalachian holler, it was just good sense. Skillet-fried cornmeal mush. Before polenta became fashionable in Italian restaurants, Appalachian families were already doing this and calling it cornmeal mush. Thick-cooked cornmeal porridge was poured into a loaf pan, cooled to a firm slab, then sliced and fried in lard or bacon drippings until each piece had a golden, crackled crust and a steaming, soft interior with that unmistakable, deep corn sweetness. Slices landed on the table before supper with a thread of sorghum syrup or a smear of apple butter alongside. In the economically struggling Appalachian communities of the early 1970s, still feeling the aftershocks of the coal industry's decline, a warm platter of fried mush before the meal was comfort in the purest, most fundamental sense. Made entirely from the pantry, costs almost nothing, tastes like home. Restaurants now call it polenta frite. The price tag is considerably higher. Chowchow Relish. Every September in 1970s Appalachian kitchens, the sharp, warm smell of pickling spice and vinegar steam meant one thing: chowchow season. This tangy, chunky relish, green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, peppers, corn, and whatever else hadn't been put up yet, was the way hillbilly families captured the last flavors of summer before the frost. The vegetables got chopped, combined with vinegar, sugar, mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric, simmered down and ladled into mason jars. Making it was a community event. The jars lined the counter like trophies. At the table, a small dish of chowchow beside a skillet of cornbread was the signal that dinner was served. Its bright acidity cutting through richness, its complexity making simple food taste like something deeply considered. Today, it's making a slow comeback through food preservationists. The best version is still in somebody's root cellar. Pickled beets and onions. No pantry shelf in 1970s Appalachia was complete without them. Those deep crimson jars, glowing like stained glass, smelling of vinegar and warm spice every time the lid came off. Late summer beets, boiled until tender, sliced and packed into mason jars with sliced onion and a brine of vinegar, sugar, cloves, allspice, and cinnamon, processed until shelf-stable and left to cure into something jewel-like and extraordinary. Sweet, tangy, earthy, warmly spiced. The onions turned pink and silky. The beets bled their brilliant color into everything they touched. Served cold from the jar before the main meal, they brought color to tables dominated by beige and brown, and their bright acidity cut through pork and starch like nothing else. Grandmothers famous for their pickled beets were legends at church potlucks. Their jars were requested, traded, given as gifts. The best ones are still made in farmhouse kitchens from garden beets. Fatback Popcorn. Here's the one that stops people cold. Popcorn popped in rendered fatback drippings. Yes, exactly what it sounds like, and better than it has any right to be. Commercial vegetable oil was an expense in many 1970s Appalachian households. What was always on the shelf near the stove was a jar of fatback drippings, rendered pork fat saved from cooking, used to flavor everything, including, as it turned out, popcorn. Dried corn kernels into a heavy pot with the hot drippings, covered, shaken over the heat until the last kernel popped. The result was popcorn with a faintly smoky, deeply savory backbone that butter popcorn cannot approach. salted hard and served in a bowl before the evening meal or beside a fire while someone told a story. Today, artisan companies sell bacon fat popcorn as a specialty product. In 1970s Appalachian kitchens, it was just what you made when the corn was dry and the drippings jar was full. Pickled okra. Pickling solved the okra problem entirely. Whole small pods, packed tight and vertical into mason jars with garlic, dill, red pepper flakes, and mustard seed, covered in sharp vinegar brine and processed until shelf-stable, came out of the jar weeks later completely transformed. Crisp, genuinely snappy, tangy, garlicky, with a slow-building heat and zero trace of sliminess. Children who refused every other okra preparation ate pickled okra without complaint. You picked up a whole pod, bit in, got the satisfying crunch, and reached for another. Magic, explained entirely by chemistry. In 1970s hillbilly kitchens, canning pickled okra required precision. The pods had to be harvested at exactly the right size. The brine had to be perfectly balanced. And women who mastered it earned lasting respect. Farmers markets now sell these for premium prices. The jar your grandmother made from her own garden row was the standard against which all others were measured. Cornbread croutons. Yesterday's skillet cornbread became today's crunchy appetizer, because in 1970s Appalachian kitchens, nothing went to waste and everything had a second life. Leftover cornbread, cut or crumbled into rough cubes, went into a skillet with butter or bacon drippings and toasted over medium heat until golden and crisp on all sides. The exterior caramelized slightly. The interior dried to a dense, almost cookie-like texture that shattered satisfyingly. Served in a bowl alongside chowchow for dipping or apple butter for spreading, they were the hillbilly equivalent of bread service, casual, warm, and completely addictive. They also hit soups and bean pots like edible sponges, soaking up pot liquor and softening just enough to become something else entirely. Zero-waste cooking elevated into genuine pleasure. Today, restaurant menus list cornbread croutons as a southern nod. Back in the holler, it was just what you did with the leftovers. Fried morel mushrooms. Morel hunting spots were guarded like family secrets, passed from parent to child, kept from neighbors, never written down. These wild mushrooms appeared for a brief, magical window each spring in the Appalachian forests, near old apple orchards and dying elms, following the first warm rains after the final frost. Finding them required forest knowledge that couldn't be bought. The preparation was reverently simple. Split lengthwise, soaked in salted water, dredged in flour or cornmeal, and fried in butter. Always butter for morels, until the crust turned golden and the honeycomb interior went tender and impossibly earthy, rich with an umami depth that defied how simple the preparation was. To be offered a plate of fried morels in a hillbilly home was to be genuinely honored. Fresh morels now sell for $40 to $60 a pound at specialty markets. In 1970s Appalachia, if you knew the right hillside and got up early enough, they were free. Black walnuts with salt. 2 ingredients, 0 cooking, maximum intensity. Black walnuts, native to North America, growing wild throughout Appalachia, are nothing like the mellow English walnuts sold in grocery stores. They're assertive, earthy, resinous, and almost funky, with a flavor that doesn't suggest nuttiness so much as demand it. Cracking them required a hammer or a rock. Their shells are legendarily hard. In 1970s hillbilly households, cracking black walnuts was an autumn evening event. The whole family sitting together, cracking and picking meat from the shell, fingers staining deep brown from the hulls. The nut meats were spread on a tray, salted generously, and passed around before dinner. chewy, intensely flavored, salt-forward, with a complexity the combination of salt and natural tannins produced that was remarkable without being fussy. Today, they're a gourmet specialty item sold at considerable cost because the labor of harvesting them is so significant. In 1970s Appalachia, that labor was just an evening well spent. Persimmon Leather. Patience was the entire recipe. The American persimmon, small, wild, and ferociously astringent when unripe, had to be collected only after the first hard frost had transformed it into something honey-sweet, custard-soft, and warmly complex with hints of apricot and brown sugar. Pick one too early, and the experience has been compared to eating alum. But a frost-ripe persimmon, pressed through a sieve, spread thin on wooden boards, and left to dry in the sun for several days, became something ancient and extraordinary. A flexible, chewy, intensely sweet sheet of concentrated fruit flavor. Native Americans had made it for centuries. Appalachian families kept the tradition alive through the 1970s, rolling the leather and storing it as a pre-meal sweet bite or between-meal snack. The original fruit roll-up, made from something that fell free from the fence row trees every October. Food scholars now celebrate the American persimmon as one of North America's most underappreciated fruits. Fried salt pork strips. We end where hillbilly cooking truly begins. Salt pork, thick slabs of pork belly or side meat cured heavily in salt, was the pantry meat that stood between Appalachian families and a hungry winter. No refrigeration, no grocery store within easy reach, no margin for waste. When fried into strips, it became something beyond a cooking ingredient. It became the appetizer that announced a meal worth waiting for. Rinsed, patted dry, laid into a cold cast-iron skillet brought slowly to heat, the fat rendering out gradually until the strips crisped into something resembling thick-cut bacon, but saltier, meatier, with a dense chew and a pork intensity no commercial product replicates. The kitchen filled with the greatest smell in the history of cooking: salt, fat, heat, and thyme. Placed on a plate at the center of the table before supper, with pickled beets alongside, maybe a wedge of cornbread. Pepperoni rolls. Back in 1927, Italian immigrant Giuseppe Argiro opened a bakery in Fairmont, West Virginia, right in the heart of coal country. The miners had a problem. They needed lunches that could survive 12-hour shifts in hot, dusty mines without spoiling. Argiro's solution became a West Virginia institution. He took soft bread dough, wrapped it around sticks of pepperoni, and baked them until golden. The pepperoni's natural oils and salt acted as preservatives, while the sealed dough package kept out coal dust and mine grime. You'd roll out simple white bread dough, place a whole 6-inch pepperoni stick in the center, sometimes add a slice of mozzarella, then roll it tight and bake until golden brown. When a miner bit into one deep underground, he got that spicy, greasy, salty punch of meat and bread that made black coffee taste like luxury. This wasn't fancy food. It was survival food that could handle 100-degree tunnels without refrigeration. If you're enjoying this journey through food history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss future videos. Fried apple pies. These weren't your grandmother's lattice-topped beauties cooling on a windowsill. Mountain hand pies were portable, practical, and built to last a workday. From the 1880s through the 1950s, Appalachian women would take dried apple slices, preserved from the previous fall, and rehydrate them overnight in a little water and sugar, sometimes with cinnamon if the family could afford it. The next morning, they'd roll out biscuit dough thin, cut it into circles about 6 inches across, and spoon the apple mixture onto one half. Fold it over, crimp the edges with a fork to seal tight, then drop them into a cast-iron skillet with hot lard or bacon grease. The pies would fry until both sides turned golden and crispy, creating a sealed pocket that kept the filling from leaking out. These hand pies could survive being tossed into a lunch pail, riding on horseback to a logging camp, or sitting in the sun while a farmer worked his tobacco. The fried crust acted like armor, and the concentrated sweetness of those dried apples made them feel like dessert, even though they were practical fuel. Fried green tomatoes. When frost threatened in September, mountain families stripped their tomato plants of every unripe fruit. Waste wasn't an option. These hard, sour green tomatoes became a staple in lunch pails across Appalachia from the 1890s onward. The preparation was simple but required skill. You'd slice the green tomatoes thick, about a ½ inch, so they wouldn't fall apart. Dip them in buttermilk if you had it, or just water if you didn't, then dredge through cornmeal mixed with salt and pepper. Some families added a little flour to help the coating stick. Into a hot skillet with bacon grease they'd go, frying until each side developed a crispy, golden brown crust. The heat would soften the tomato just enough to create a contrast, crunchy outside, tangy and firm inside. These weren't just clever, they were strategic. Fried green tomatoes could sit at room temperature all morning without getting soggy or spoiling. Loggers and miners would eat them cold, straight from the pail, enjoying that sharp, acidic bite that cut through the heaviness of biscuits and fatback. Ham sandwiches on thick sliced bread. Before Wonder Bread, there was farm bread, massive loaves baked once a week in wood-fired ovens. From the 1870s through the 1940s, Appalachian families would slice this bread thick, nearly an inch across, creating sandwiches that were more bread than filling, but exactly what hard labor demanded. The ham was usually country ham, salt-cured and aged for months in smokehouses, sliced thin but intensely flavored. A single slice of that salty, ruby-red ham between two slabs of dense homemade bread created a lunch that could last. The bread would be slightly stale by morning, which was actually perfect. It held together better and didn't get soggy. Some folks would spread a little lard on the bread for moisture. Others added nothing at all. The salt from the ham would slowly penetrate the bread as it sat in the lunch pail, seasoning each bite. These sandwiches went into coal mines, tobacco fields, and logging camps. They weren't fancy, but they delivered what workers needed: carbohydrates for energy, protein for muscle, and enough salt to replace what sweat took away during 10-hour shifts in brutal conditions. Cold biscuits with sorghum. Leftover biscuits never went to waste in the mountains. From the 1880s through the 1960s, families would save the previous night's biscuits for next-day lunches. These weren't the fluffy, buttery southern biscuits you'd find at a restaurant. These were hard-working biscuits made with lard and minimal rising agent, designed to fill stomachs cheaply. By morning, they'd be cold and slightly firm, but that was the point. A worker would split the biscuit in half and drizzle dark sorghum molasses over each side. Sorghum was cheaper than white sugar and provided deep, almost earthy sweetness with a mineral tang that white sugar couldn't match. The thick syrup would soak into the dense biscuit, creating pockets of sweetness throughout. Some folks added a smear of butter if they had it, but most just relied on the sorghum. This combination delivered quick energy from the molasses and staying power from the wheat and lard. Timber workers would eat these standing up, syrup dripping onto their boots, getting that sugar rush before attacking another day of felling trees with handsaws and axes in the steep mountain terrain.
Pork and vinegar sandwich. In the lean years of rural poverty, pork was the meat that sustained Appalachian families. Every part of the pig had purpose. The pork and vinegar sandwich took cheap cuts of pork shoulder, boiled until falling apart tender in large iron pots, then shredded and doused in sharp, acrid vinegar infused with pepper and salt. This wasn't barbecue sauce, this was pure stinging vinegar that cut through the richness of the meat like a knife. Piled hot onto biscuits or soft white bread, the sandwich was tangy, slightly tough, and absolutely filling. The vinegar served multiple purposes. It preserved the meat when refrigeration was unreliable, tenderized tough cuts, and stretched resources by making a little meat go a long way when mixed with bread. In West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, this was weeknight supper, made in massive batches that fed families of 8 or more. The sharp, puckering vinegar flavor became comfort itself. the taste of survival, ingenuity, and the kind of food that doesn't need money to be magnificent. This sandwich reminds us that sometimes the simplest ingredients create the most enduring memories.
Leather breeches. Don't let the name fool you. These weren't pants. Leather breeches were green beans, strung on thread and dried until they looked like old leather strips. This preservation method, used throughout Appalachia from the 1700s onward, turned summer's abundance into winter and spring sustenance. Women would string fresh green beans, Kentucky Wonders were preferred, on heavy thread, creating long garlands hung from rafters in the cabin. They'd dry for weeks until brown and leathery. Come lunch packing time, a handful of these dried beans would go into a tin pail. At the work site, they'd be eaten as is, tough and chewy, requiring serious jaw work but providing fiber and minerals. Some miners would pour hot water over them from a thermos, letting them rehydrate slightly before eating. The beans had an intense, concentrated flavor, earthy, slightly smoky if they'd hung near the wood stove, and deeply vegetable. They tasted like hard work and forward planning. Modern folks might find them unappetizing, but to a coal miner in 1920, they represented summer sunshine in the middle of a dark shaft, and the foresight of a wife who knew how to keep her family fed year-round.
Chitterling sandwich. Chitterlings, the intestines of pigs, represented the ultimate nose-to-tail eating decades before it became fashionable. Boiled for hours until tender and flavored with vinegar, spices, and rendered fat, these sandwiches carried a distinctive, intense flavor that wasn't for everyone. The texture was chewy and slightly gelatinous, with an aroma that filled entire homes and announced dinner from blocks away. Placed on soft bread or biscuits, often with hot sauce and onions, this sandwich was economical brilliance, using parts that would otherwise be discarded. In black communities throughout the rural South, chitterlings represented cultural heritage and resourcefulness dating back generations. What outsiders sometimes dismissed as poor man's food, families understood as ancestral cooking, carrying stories of survival and celebration. These weren't shameful meals, they were Friday night traditions, holiday dishes prepared with pride and served at family tables with dignity. The chitterling sandwich taught important lessons, that every part of what feeds you deserves respect, that cultural food traditions held power regardless of economics, and that flavor and meaning transcend social class. This dish survives today as soul food, proof that some foods endure because they're genuinely delicious and deeply important.
Salmon patties. Canned salmon was one of the few luxury proteins mountain families could afford, and they stretched it as far as possible. From the 1920s through the 1960s, salmon patties became a lunch staple. The night before, mothers would open a can of pink salmon, bones and skin included, nothing wasted, and mash it with leftover cornbread or stale breadcrumbs, an egg if available, and a little chopped onion. Form the mixture into patties and fry them in bacon grease until both sides developed a crispy, golden crust. By morning, these patties were cold and firm, perfect for the lunch pail. They wouldn't fall apart, wouldn't spoil in moderate temperatures, and delivered that fish oil richness that bodies needed. The bones, mashed in with everything else, provided calcium that mountain diets often lacked. Workers would eat them with their hands, the crispy exterior giving way to that soft, fishy center. Some folks made them small, like silver dollar pancakes. Others preferred them larger, like hamburger patties. Either way, they represented prosperity in a can. Ocean fish making its way to landlocked hollows, providing protein when deer season was over and the chickens weren't laying. Dried apple slices. Simple, portable, and nearly indestructible. From the late 1700s onward, Appalachian families dried apples every fall as insurance against winter and spring hunger. They'd core and slice apples thin, usually golden delicious or wine saps, and string them on thread or lay them on screens in the sun, sometimes in the rafters near the wood stove. After weeks of drying, the slices would shrink to leathery rings, concentrated with sugar and flavor. These went into every lunch pail. Workers would chew them slowly, rehydrating them slightly with saliva, releasing that intense apple sweetness. They were tough. You couldn't just bite through them. You had to gnaw and suck, making each piece last. The chewing motion itself was satisfying, giving jaw muscles something to do during breaks. These dried apples provided quick energy from natural sugars, required no refrigeration, wouldn't spoil for months, and weighed almost nothing. Loggers would carry pounds of them into week-long camps. Miners kept them in their pockets. Children would get a handful for school. In lean times, these apple rings might be the only sweet thing a family had, making them precious beyond their simple ingredients.